This meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 131 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Just want to make sure we address that echo.
Or maybe it's me. Maybe it's me.
Okay. As always, I do want to start by acknowledging that we are gathered on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and to express gratitude that we're able to do the important work of this committee on lands that they've stewarded since time immemorial. I also just want to remind and ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines written on the updated cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. You will also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, June 5th, 2024, the committee resumed consideration of Bill C-61, an act respecting water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure on First Nations lands. But before we go into clause-by-clause consideration, this will be the last meeting that we projected under our initial budget. So you will have received in your email a supplementary budget to be approved for our next meeting so that we can have food that we're all able to enjoy to do our work. So I just want to make sure that we have unanimous consent to approve the supplementary budget. Okay. Seeing we have unanimous consent, that's approved. I will sign that and bring that to our liaison committee in short order. So with that, we are going to return to clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-61. And again, to help us with clause-by-clause consideration, I would like to welcome back our witnesses. From the Department of Indigenous Services, we have Nelson Barbosa, Director General, Community Infrastructure Bank. We have Rebecca Blake, Acting Director, Legislation, Engagement, and Regulations. And we have Douglas Fairburn, Senior Counsel, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. And I also want to remind members that the amendments are confidential and sub-amendments are to be shared electronically or in paper in both official languages and sent to the clerk for distribution. So with that, we will resume debate on the amendment of Mr. Morris, PV2. And I just will also note that if PV2 is adopted, NDP 26 and G4 cannot be moved due to a line conflict, but just I think G4. NDP 26 was withdrawn. So G4 cannot be moved due to a line conflict if PV2 is adopted. So with that, I will give the floor back to Mr. Morris.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just draw your attention. I believe you've received the sub-amendment from Ms. Idlout since our last meeting, and so maybe I'll leave it to Ms. Idlout to move that sub-amendment.
Okay, Ms. Idlout.
Yes, thank you. Regarding the pick, I would like to begin by under the item PV2, the wording regarding economic, I would like to add indigenous opening. Opening dan puiko simagang. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. So, colleagues, you will have received in your email the updated, should have received the updated sub-amendments. Yeah. If not, it should be, okay, it's being sent right now. So you should have that very shortly. It is fairly straightforward, but as always, we want to make sure that we have that clearly in front of, oh, and here it is. So The French version you have is right here, and the English version would have been circulated by Ms. Idlout about an hour ago. So with that, we can open it up to debate. Does anybody want to make an intervention related to the sub-amendment? Mr. Melillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It has been some time since we've discussed this bill, so I just want to confirm a couple things. I appreciate what Ms. Idlout is bringing forward. I think I still have the same concerns with PV2 and the inclusion of economic needs as was mentioned previously. I just want to confirm with our witnesses, our officials rather, that are here, what sort of let me just start, if you feel that economic needs is perhaps out of scope with what this bill is aiming to achieve.
Thanks for the questions. Good to be back. Good to see all of you. I think where we last left off, we talked about you could, I think, make the case on scope. I think that was part of the conversation, and I think there was also contemplation around the ability to quantify what would be the overall impact of the inclusion of the word economic. I believe encapsulates our previous conversation.
I appreciate that. I don't want to reiterate what was said, but I just wanted to make sure that was clear. So I would just say to Mr. Chair, for our side, we maintain that those economic needs are, it's a bit unclear what that would be. I believe out of scope of what this bill is hoping to achieve, and for that reason I wouldn't support the main amendment and would just extend that to the sub-amendment as well, since we would not be supporting the amendment. Just wanted to get that on the record. Thank you.
Mr. Melillo, I see Mr. Morris has signed up. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll just reiterate from our last meeting, as I shared last time on the same point, to remind committee members that by virtue of the amendment being ruled admissible, which it has been by virtue of being moved, that means for the committee that what is in that amendment is in fact within scope. It is within the scope of this bill because it's been moved. And I hope that committee members would keep that in mind as they consider this proposal that Ms. Idlout's put forward to add spiritual to the needs of First Nations that would be provided for by this bill, as well as the original amendment that would also add economic. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morris. Not seeing any other hands up, why don't we go to a vote here? So shall the sub-amendment to PV2 carry?
Just on the sub-amendment, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Mr. Battis?
Miss Atwin, because her name is
Yeah.
alphabetically before me.
Yeah,
And it's her file?
She got called first.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't hear that.
Mr. Henley?
My bad.
We're voting for Mr. Henley?
We're voting for spiritual, yes, but not for the...
Mr. Henley?
Yes.
Mr. McLeod?
Mr. McLeod.
McLeod?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear her. Yes.
Mr. Scapoligia?
Yes.
Mr. Melillo?
Against.
Mr. Lippert?
No.
Mr. Weber?
No.
Mr. Zimmer?
No.
Monsieur Lemire?
Simard, oui.
Simard.
On nous confond souvent.
Ouais.
We often get mixed up with each other.
Mrs. Loud?
I say yes.
Yeas 7, nays 4.
Okay, so with that, the motion is, the amendment is sub-amended. And so now we're back to the amendment as sub-amendment. Is there any intervention or debate on this motion? Mr. Batiste.
Yeah, I just want to for the record that I think that the addition of spiritual is a good thing. The community's needs. What we have a problem with government is when we have the word economic in there. I think that we've been told that that's not part of what this legislation is aimed at doing, and for that reason, we kind of support this with the word economic in there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batiste. Not seeing any other hands up. Let's go to a vote. So shall PB2 as amended carry?
Ms. Atwin,
No.
Mr. Baptiste,
No.
The clerk is not speaking into the mic, so I can't hear what he's saying.
Mr. Henley,
No.
Mr. McLeod, Mr. Scaparella,
No.
Mr. Melillo,
No.
Mr. Lippert,
No.
Mr. Vidal,
No.
Mr. Zimmer,
No.
Monsieur Simard,
Oui.
Mrs. Lout, Miss Idlaut,
I say yes.
Yeas 2, nays 9.
Okay, so PB2 is defeated, which takes us to G4. And I'll turn the floor over to Ms. Atwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that Bill C-61 in Clause 15 be amended by replacing line 31 on page 10 with the following: management needs of the First Nation, taking into account its cultural and spiritual needs, and based on its, continue. So again, it enshrines the importance that we've all recognized for including cultural and spiritual. It also responds to requests from the Assembly of First Nations and our partners who worked with us on this bill. It's also consistent with UNDRIP as well. So this is important for us, and we'd like to, I think it's more concise as well, and it captures, again, what partners were requesting of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Is there any debate on G4? Mr. Melillo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not to debate, but just to reiterate that we're supportive of this. We had concerns, the same concerns raised by the Liberals in the previous amendment and sub-amendment, just in case that was not clear. Just wanted to make sure of our position on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. Not seeing any other hands up. Let's go to a vote. So shall G4 carry? I think we have unanimous consent here, so G4 is carried. Which takes us to Clause 15. So shall Clause 15 carry? Looks like on division. Great. So that moves us on to Clause 16, and the first amendment, or the only amendment we have here, is NDP 27. So I'll just open the floor to Ms. Idlaut if she wishes to move NDP 27.
Thank you, Chairperson. Regarding NDP 27, as a committee, it was given to me by the BC Assembly of First Nations. They have requested to amend, make an amendment that the minister must work towards the water that's being used in First Nations lands, and for the protection and then adjacent lands. Reading lines 5 to 7 on page 11 with the following.
wastewater effluent standards in place in the province or territory where the First Nation lands of that First Nation are located.
And subsection 2, to add applies and despite any exercise of the jurisdictions referred to in section 6. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. Open it up to debate. I see Ms. Atwin has her hand up, and I'll pass the floor over to Ms. Atwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We debated a similar amendment that also included this piece around the minister must, which the concern is just that it's removing that self-determination piece again for individual First Nations on how their laws will be applied over territories. And the idea that protection agreements will be forthcoming as well. And so it's again about that self-determined piece. It's about ensuring that they are the ones to drive that process as well. We don't want to be too prescriptive. And so while well-intentioned again, I think it removes the power of individual communities to pick that standard which they would prefer. I would also defer to our experts again for kind of clarifying if I'm understanding that correctly, but that's my position on this one.
Yes, you are correct in terms of deferring from First Nation choice, as well as kind of those agreements in collaboration with provinces and territories as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Mr. Melillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize, Mr. Batista. I know you're eager, but I just have a couple questions on this. Along the same lines as Ms. Atwin, the first actually is about, with the word adjacent in there. I know we had a discussion at length, Mr. Chair, about adjacency, and it was removed in previous clauses of the bill. Would reintroducing adjacency in this instance have any, cause any inconsistencies or any complications in the legislation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think similar to a conversation we had on water, reintroduction of the word adjacency may create inconsistency throughout the bill.
Okay, thank you. And then just further to that, not to belabor the point, but as Ms. Atwin mentioned, there's the issue of choice, and I think enforceability. It mentions not just First Nation lands, but the protection zones as well. We don't know, of course, exactly what those are going to look like at this point. It potentially could include lands that would not be part of the First Nation. Do you foresee, to the experts, do you foresee any challenges with how that would be enforced if it includes lands not in the First Nation?
Appreciate the question. It could potentially predetermine what's in agreements that are agreed to by provinces, territories, and First Nations themselves, so it would have an effect on those choices for those multiple jurisdictions.
Okay. So it would essentially remove the choice not just from the First Nation, but potentially from the provinces and territories as well? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. Not seeing any other hands up. Let's go to a vote. So shall NDP 27 carry?
Mr.
Yes.
Mr. Twing,
No.
Mr. Battis,
No.
Mr. Henley,
No.
Mr. McLeod,
No.
Mr. Scaparija,
No.
Mr. Melillo,
No.
Mr. Lippert,
No.
Mr. Vido,
No.
Mr. Zimmer,
No.
Monsieur Simard,
No.
Mrs. Lout,
I say yes.
Yeas 10, nays 1. Sorry. Yeas 1, nays 10.
So NDP 27 is defeated. So which takes us to clause 16. Shall clause 16 carry?
Agreed.
On division. Shall clause 17 carry?
Agreed.
On division. Which takes us to clause 18. And the amendment we have here is NDP 28. So I'll open the floor for the moving of NDP 28. Ms. Idlout, the floor is yours.
Done.
Regarding NDB 28, it was given to us by the BC Assembly of First Nations. And the amendment is, if it wasn't voted by, how do we want this to proceed? I wouldn't mind if I wouldn't mind if this were to be passed as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. Open it up for debate. Not seeing any hands. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Melillo.
I hope it's not a tough one. I just want to confirm if NDB 28 were to pass, if it would have any impacts on CPC 1 in its admissibility. Okay.
No, I can confirm that those are not, that will not affect CPC 1. Okay, so not seeing any of their hands up, we can move to a vote. Shall NDP 28 carry?
Ms. Atwin?
No.
Mr. Baptiste?
No.
Mr. Henley? Mr. McLeod?
No.
Mr. Scapareggia?
No.
Mr. Melillo?
No.
Mr. Lippert?
No.
Mr. Vidal?
No.
Mr. Zimmer?
No.
Monsieur Simard?
No.
Ms. Idlout?
Anyakpong.
I say yes.
Yes, 1, nays 10.
So NDP 28 is defeated, which takes us to CPC 1. I'll open the floor to Mr. Melillo. Would you like to move CPC 1?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been waiting for this moment for a while here, so I appreciate that opportunity. So I think CPC 1, the wording is fairly straightforward. I'll just quickly read it in. That it would add number 3, the minister must obtain the consent of the First Nation governing body before applying the standards referred to in paragraph 1A or B. Just would quickly, for our committee members, for the benefit, I think we heard from multiple First Nations that have expressed concerns regarding potential power of the minister in this legislation, the Minister of Indigenous Services, to potentially impose regulations and other decisions upon them. We've heard it during this study. We've heard it from other studies as well. But I believe that if First Nation governing body does not choose a standard, the minister can still work with First Nations to determine which standard will apply. But the governing body will ultimately decide, and having that consent will ensure that there is a meaningful, not just a consultation with each First Nation, but ensuring that the power of decision making is in the First Nation. I've got some more to say on that, but maybe I'll stop there and see what my colleagues feel about this before going any further. But I think that this will be a great way to strengthen the bill to ensure that First Nations can guide their destiny with this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. So with that, we'll open to debate. Ms. Atwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could just quickly ask about what the possible implications of this wording would be. We've gone with consultation and cooperation because it aligns with UNDRIP and previous legislation that already exists. Of course, I certainly understand and know what free, prior, and informed consent means, especially in the context of local communities that I represent. Also, New Brunswick has a policy provincially, and so I'm just concerned that perhaps the way it's placed, that it's actually more bureaucracy that could perhaps lead to delay in implementing the measures in this act that we've been waiting so long for. So I'd just like to know if I'm interpreting this correctly. Could this, in fact, actually hold things up for First Nations?
Appreciate the question. There is the possibility, due to a lack of consent on what consent means across different First Nations. So this is proposed amendments in relation to the application of standards to ensure there's safe drinking water and wastewater services on First Nation lands, and the choice of those standards. So should all those discussions need to happen individually with different kind of definitions of consent, it could slow down the application of those standards. I'd also just point to Section 6 that was already looked at in terms of 6A, which allows for First Nation lawmaking. So First Nation laws could always make a different choice at any time as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwood. Mr. Batiste.
So I see in this 18.1 that we've already said that the that for the purposes of Section 14 and 16, if a choice is not specified by a First Nations governing body, the minister, in consultation and cooperation with the First Nations governor, must determine. And so it's already some strong language in there. I'm wondering, would it be something that someone would be able to argue that, if we didn't have maybe a band council resolution or a vote by that community, that, outside entities could challenge that the legislation wasn't followed and could end up delaying the implementation of a water standard in that community?
You are correct. As well, just noting kind of back to that Section 6 as well, that it really leaves it open in terms of First Nation lawmaking and what First Nation governance systems are chosen by them. So with adding more prescription in there, that would take less choice away from First Nations.
Okay.
Mr. Batiste, next I'll turn it over to Ms. Idlout.
Just very quickly, where else in the bill does it require the minister obtaining consent of the First Nation governing body?
It doesn't require consent. However, in the principles section, it does require that all decisions be guided by the principle of free, prior, and informed consent.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Idlout. Mr. Melillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the questions from the colleagues and the answers as well. I think this idea of consent, is something we spoke about in previous clauses, especially with UNDRIP. Obviously, within this bill, as you just mentioned, it's supposed to be guided by UNDRIP, which would require free, prior, and informed consent. So I guess I would be curious to know how free, prior, and informed consent would differ from consent as it's written in this proposed amendment here.
Appreciate the question. The difference is in the principles section, it's to guide decision-making, free, prior, and informed consent, whereas the proposed amendment is to require that consent. So it's a different level of authority.
Right. And I appreciate the principle. I think it's a great principle, but principles are not, well, they're a bit loose, I suppose. We heard about consultation and cooperation. That's a term that I think can be defined many different ways. We've heard, not just on this bill, but many previous bills, that the government claimed was, co-developed, or there was adequate consultation, and we heard a very different thing from First Nation leaders on the ground. Mr. Chair, I worry that, let me back up. We look at Ms. Idlout's question and the answer, where is consent found in this bill? It's not, aside from the principle section, which is not really that enforceable, if I'm not mistaken. It's more of an idea than anything. Throughout this bill, the minister has a lot of authority. Obviously, we hope the minister would make great decisions and positive decisions with that authority, but when we're dealing with something as critical as drinking water, I don't know how we can deny First Nations the opportunity to have that decision-making authority, Mr. Chair. So I would implore my colleagues to consider that. I would share, I think there's a couple hands, but I'll just share briefly. We heard a couple quotes directly at the committee that the legislation imposes a federal framework by which we can create our own laws, but we don't need legislation to do so. That was Chief Sheldon Sunshine. We heard from Vice Chief David Pratt, said that if they're, this is the quote, if they're allowed to proceed without our consent, that's going to cause problems. Clayton Leonard mentioned that one of the criticisms is that the preamble mentions Article 19 of UNDRIP, and then throughout the legislation, it is he used the term watered down, Mr. Chair. So I think we've heard from many stakeholders, national organizations as well as local First Nations, that they don't feel they're adequately consulted on this, and that they have concerns with the powers that the minister would have over their what should be their jurisdiction, in my opinion. So again, I'll stop there because I think there's a few other comments that would like to be made. I would just ask my colleagues that seem to be moving the other direction to reconsider in favor of ensuring First Nations have that authority and that decision-making power. If we truly believe in free, prior, and informed consent, I don't believe there's any reason that we would be opposed to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Melillo. We'll go first to Ms. Atwin and then to Ms. Idlout afterwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm a bit perplexed as to kind of the change in heart, because we've had discussions around this terminology before, also with regards to other amendments specifically, and with other bills that we've studied at this committee. And we've had a bit of a different viewpoint. I'll actually read a quote from one of our members, Mr. Schmale. I remember back to the whole discussion when we were debating and discussing the UN Declaration legislation here at this committee. And one of the issues that we as the opposition had was the definition of pre, prior, and informed consent, and what actually that meant. And I remember I said, and so did many others on this side, that if we don't actually do the work and start defining some of these major pieces of this legislation, we're going to wind up in trouble at some point and potentially in court. Is that the goal with this amendment here, is to tie this up and to ensure that First Nations are not actually finally receiving the legal precedent, the framework, the support with again, funding that'll be tied to this in the future? So I'm just wondering why the change of heart now? Again, we have it in the principles section. We already have the bill that proposes the co-development as described in UNDRIP, which is already the recognized precedent, which is consultation and cooperation, which has been clearly defined. Again, in the context of my own province and the communities that I represent, free, prior, and informed consent all day long, because we already defined it in that context. Where it's not defined, and you've kind of changed your opinion on it, are you wanting to see this stalled? Is that what this amendment is about? I'd like some further clarification on that. Thank you.
I'll let Mr. Melillo respond quickly before going to Ms. Idlout.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate the question. I don't appreciate, frankly, the tone of it, Mr. Chair, but look, we've been very clear that we've had concerns with not defining a number of things, and that is one, obviously, the definition of consent, because people don't seem to be able to define it. Ms. Atwin has mentioned that in New Brunswick, perhaps that's not the case. Maybe that's something we should be looking to. And I'm happy to do the work to give it that definition so that it is strengthened. But the goal of this, as I've said, we've heard from a number of First Nation leaders, Mr. Chair, expressing concerns that their voices were not heard on this, or previous pieces of legislation, but of course particularly C-61, and they want to ensure that they have the authority to govern their lands, their waters, as they should be able to. That's the goal, Mr. Chair. I recognize that the definition of consent could be problematic, but I would say to the member, let's work to define it. Let's put that work in. But to me, it does not make sense to include something in a principle in a preamble, say you support it, and then not put it throughout the rest of the bill, Mr. Chair. To me, that it just doesn't make sense. I'm not going to make any further speculations or political commentary to it, because I don't believe that that's going to be helpful here. But I just think for the consistency's sake, it would make sense to include it. I think we've heard from a number of leaders on this, Mr. Chair. So that would be that's the goal here, to ensure the First Nations have the consent and authority. So I know Ms. Idlout wants to comment, so I'll cede the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Melillo. With that, we'll turn the floor over to Ms. Idlout.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate that I'm in support of CPC1 because there must be consent, and it's important that Indigenous people and they don't have the tools to implement. Like I was saying earlier, that if it's not included, where is it? Where is the word consent? But it's not in there, but it's in the foundation. The foundations are there for us to consider. I meant, because I think this is a bit weak. Therefore, I am in support of this because it is strengthening the and that first Indigenous people must always have must give consent, and we as Indigenous people would have we would be stronger. I know we are talking about fresh water. It's to strengthen the Indigenous people will be given some strength with their rights. I mean, strengthening their rights. I also want to mention this regarding C-61. When it was being developed, we were told that the federal government was working with First Nations people. If this is true, and if this will be the way, the minister should be working with Indigenous people. And when he has if it were to enact laws, if he were to enact laws, will be better, because this will be work towards reconciliation, and this we can move in a positive direction if First Nations will be given freshwater bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Idlout, I see Mr. Zimmer.
Yeah, I guess just in response to Ms. Atwin, and this is the Liberals' game after all, right? It's to make water for First Nations a part of this legislation, and if this legislation isn't completely taken as is, then it's going to affect water on First Nations and the ability to access it. But your government's been in power for 9 years. Certainly this legislation isn't keeping you from getting clean water to First Nations. But that's what you're trying to portray in what you just said, Ms. Atwin. So I guess I think we should get back to, if it's actually about water, make it about water. And we can keep going. But, you know, again, this is a bit of the Liberals' game is, you know, you've already been at it for 9 years, but for some reason you still haven't got it done, and it's somebody else's fault. So your government, let me remind you of that. Thank you. Well said.
Thank you, Mr. I'll pass the floor over to Ms. Atwin.
Yes, Mr. Chair. And you know, I really had hoped we wouldn't descend into this kind of partisanship, and I realized that I was the one who mentioned it this morning. It's because I'm quite defensive of making sure that this bill is passed in a timely fashion, which we also heard from many, many partners who said, pass the bill without delay. And so those are also voices that I'm going to represent here at this committee. I'll also use whatever tone I feel appropriate in this place. I'm being as respectful as I can, but again, I'm going to be firm with what I'm arguing here. The idea is, I can see there's goodwill, and then that crosses over into, again, delay. Yes, First Nations communities have had to wait for far too long. This bill is not about changing those boil water advisories. We've been doing that work. We're at 97% currently. And Mr. Zimmer, you'd know that if you actually asked any of our Indigenous witnesses questions during the committee testimony on this very important bill. I would just like to pivot now back to our officials and wonder if you can further explain how this legal precedent around consult and cooperate has been enshrined in our legal framework here in Canada and how that could help us guide this discussion back to where it needs to be. Thank you.
Yes, the concept of consult and cooperate is embedded in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and that in turn draws on the language in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it is the modern terminology that is accepted globally and has been imported into Canada, and it's the sort of the gold standard in terms of dealing with Indigenous concerns. So that is why that language is used in this Bill C-61.
And again, can you speak to, again, the implications or timeframes that could be altered by using this language instead?
Yes. So right now the bill is set up in such a way that First Nations have the ability to choose the standards, but if a choice is not made, then the minister would have to work with First Nations, consult and cooperate to determine a standard, federal or provincial. So requiring consent could delay the process indefinitely if a First Nation was unable to make a decision. So this is meant to provide a practical approach to ensuring that water standards are acceptable water standards are in place on First Nation lands.
I'm just wondering if my colleagues heard that response from the officials. It's really important to the conversation we're having right now, so I'd like to know if they did.
See, Ms. Idlout has her hand up next, so I'm going to go to Ms. Idlout.
I'll ask my question in English. So CPC 1 is looking to add sub 3 under clause 18. Thinking of it in that way, does that mean that sub 3 only applies to clause 18?
Thank you for the question. I think that would be my interpretation, but it does speak to standards more broadly. Mm-hmm. So maybe just to reinforce what my colleague from the Department of Justice has kind of spoken so eloquently to, consultation and cooperation are known terms. They are found in this draft bill several times. The term consent is, I would say, in my knowledge, an unknown term. I don't understand the litmus test of consent, and I'd be concerned on implementation of the bill where there is language to both consult, cooperate, and to receive consent.
Just a follow-up question, because in part of Mr. Fairbairn's response, he said that consult and cooperate are in UNDRIP, but so is consent. And I think that because consent is also in UNDRIP, that it has to be something that we don't pick and choose what parts of UNDRIP to incorporate. And I'm just sharing my support again for CPC 1 because the relationships that can be strengthened between the minister and the First Nations, because the minister needing to get consent from the First Nations governing body will create a stronger understanding of what the First Nations might choose, or if there's no choice that's been made. It creates that opportunity for further discussion between the minister and the First Nations, and I think that is an opportunity towards reconciliation towards strengthening relationships, especially regarding standards in water. So that's why I'm going to be supporting this motion. Oyindami.
Thank you, Ms. Idlout. Next, I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Batiste.
I understand the need for us to be guided by the principles of free, prior, informed consent, and I think it's an important thing. As someone who's worked in First Nations communities most of my life before being a member of Parliament, I know that difficult choices have to be made by chief and councils. Sometimes they have to prioritize the best interests of all community members, and sometimes they will have individuals in their community that say, well, I didn't consent to that. My fear is this portion of this inclusion of this amendment is only in the circumstance where a chief and council has not made a decision whether they wanted to go to federal or provincial water standards. What my fear is that by having this kind of language that sets up community members to challenge their own chief and councils and say, well, I didn't agree with, what the cooperation and consultation that was done with my chief and council, they don't have my consent. And as a community member, it could be one community member saying they did not have my consent, which if my knowledge around consent is correctly, you have to have a willing person to give you that consent. And if one person in that community says, I don't give that consent, will that tie this up in terms of the community being able to actually get clean water? Or are we talking a consent? Are we talking about a band council resolution? Because that can be passed pretty easily. But then can a community say, well, I didn't give my consent for that band council resolution? So it ties it up in needing for that community to do a ratification of that vote. And so as someone who's seen a lot of votes in chief and councils that in my lifetime, I'm scared that this clause inserted in there may have the actual impact of community members challenging their local leadership, and because of not having clear, defined consent of what that means in this thing, I'm scared that it's going to tie it up in potential legal matters where we have people going to court against their own community members, whatever their argument is towards that would make it so that that community couldn't access First Nations clean water and First Nations in a not speedy way, but in an efficient way. And so that's my concern with this, introducing new language within something that is not predefined within the Indian Act. Now, if you were to say it requires a band council resolution as opposed to consent, I might be inclined to support that. But the word consent in itself doesn't have that built-in mechanism where chief and councils can make a decision. So I'm scared that we're creating a word, inserting it into a legislation that chief and councils will have to debate their own community members on, and this could lead to delays in having First Nations clean water. And that's why I'm thinking that we need to have a little bit more discussion about that. And I'll ask the technician if the things that I'm scared of from my knowledge of being in First Nations community, working in First Nations communities for more than 20 years, is that, do we have a way to say that consent has been given by a community that meets what this legislation would put forward?
I appreciate the question. I think the term consent, to me, is ambiguous. I wouldn't understand what the litmus test for obtaining consent in this case would be. As you've mentioned, there are other pieces of legislation that define more critically, maybe not the word consent, but how consensus is reached or cooperation is reached. But I would say that the ambiguity of the term consent and who is providing consent is not, in my mind, clear.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batiste. Mr. Mlilo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do appreciate discussion. I do appreciate the questions, the answers, the concern being raised. I truly do. Obviously, we're trying to make this as strong as possible and as consistent as possible, and that's to me, Mr. Chair, I have trouble understanding how this is a new word. I know it's new in the clause being amended, but if I'm not mistaken, we've heard here at the table multiple times throughout the course of this discussion that UNDRIP is law in Canada. I see heads nodding, which UNDRIP, of course, requires free, prior, and informed consent. So to me, this is not a new word being included. My question would be, has free, prior, and informed consent has it been lived up to? Has that been met since UNDRIP has become law in Canada? Sorry, do you want me to repeat the question?
Question?
Okay.
I appreciate the question. And I might have asked my colleague, Mr. Fairburn, as well to jump in. But in terms of UNDRIP becoming law under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, there are no kind of examples that ISK is currently aware of any issues in implementation of the principle and article around free, prior, and informed consent. Specific examples, because that piece of legislation is fairly new, we don't have any at this time.
Add, Mr. Fairburn?
No, that's correct.
Okay, I appreciate that. Can you remind us again when that act came into force?
I believe it was
it 2021?
2021? Yeah, 2021.
2021, so about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Give or take, and to date, you don't have any examples of how this article of UNDRIP has been implemented in Canada. That's correct.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that. I think that is concerning. Obviously, we're talking about something that is law in Canada that is presumably not being met and hasn't even been defined. I think, Mr. Barbosa, you mentioned that you didn't know what the litmus test would be of that. And I think that that's a legitimate concern. That's one that we've raised, frankly, on this side of the House. And I think that speaks to perhaps the further discussion that we need to determine what that would be. And I'm very open to that, Mr. Chair. But I would ask for what's currently written, what the litmus test would be for consultation and cooperation, because I think that's also very ambiguous. As I mentioned, we've heard a number of concerns from chiefs and leaders across the country with the development of this legislation, where they do not feel that they were consulted or that there was true cooperation or co-development. So I would ask if there's a defined litmus test, to use your words, for that term.
There wouldn't be a prescribed kind of definition in law. However, how we've applied it from a policy basis is really around sharing information openly and transparently, having ongoing dialogues. So not a quick check-in and views, but that ongoing dialogue that continues forever to ensure whatever is being developed, we're working together on, as well as the implementation of whatever is developed.
Okay. Okay, I appreciate that. I appreciate all the answers. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I'll just wrap up here saying I hear the concerns that have been raised. I truly do. I think that there's a broader discussion that we have to have about definitions, and I think that we could spend a lot of time doing that. Perhaps this very second is not that time to do that. But I think that overall, why we brought this forward and what we heard at committee is that First Nations largely did not feel that they were consulted adequately, and that there were concerns with the authority the minister would have, and for that reason, we're going to continue to support this as we brought it forward. We believe that giving First Nations that authority and that control will help rectify the fact that there was not that adequate consultation, and that we can ensure we are living up to that principle of consent. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Lillo. Next, I have Ms. Atwin, Mr. McLeod, and then Mr. Smell.
I'd like to request we suspend briefly. I'd like to confer with our team members and take some time.
We'll do a brief suspension. I know there's been some fruitful discussions in our short break here, but I will return back to the list of speakers that I have here, and I have Mr. McLeod next, and I think he's going to be passing his opportunity over to Mr. Batiste.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And there has been some discussions, and the only one of our concerns was around the word consent without having the ability to demonstrate that consent. But one might say that, you know, all Indian Act communities, whether they're at their beginning stages of going through, you know, different processes, would understand what a band council resolution is. And so our slight amendment to the CPC 1, which has just been sent out in both official languages, that says the minister must obtain consent of the First Nations governing body, and this is where we'd like the wording, as identified through a band council resolution, before applying the standards referred to in paragraph 1A or 1B, which gives the community to show what we believe is the path forward in terms of for a community to demonstrate that consent without having major delays in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batiste. I believe this is just about to be circulated here, so you will have that momentarily in all of your inboxes. I have first, we'll go to the speaking list here. First I have Ms. Idlout, and then I have Mr. Schmill, and then Mr. Miller.
Did you want to respond first, Eric?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. I appreciate the collaboration there. I know it's not always easy in this place, but I think we're all trying to get the best bill we can. So I don't take specific issue. I don't take any issue with what's been brought forward. I would just note I don't believe it tangibly changes much, Mr. Chair. Looking more closely at the original amendment, mentions that the minister must obtain the consent of the First Nation governing body, and I think that's an important distinction. It is not individuals. It is a governing body, which has already been previously defined earlier in the legislation. So I don't believe it tangibly changes what I had originally proposed. I think there might be some clarifying questions from other members forthcoming, but I just wanted to add my 2 cents in response. So thank you.
We'll next go to Ms. Idlout and then to Mr. Schmill.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions / concerns, I think. The first one is under the definitions, we have a definition of the First Nations governing body, which means a council, government, or other entity that is authorized to act. So in that first question / concern, if there is a government or other entity that is authorized, if this amendment is as identified through a band council resolution, are those two other forms of governance included in the definition?
Likely no. No, the band council resolution would deal directly with a council. So if you're talking about a government or other entity, it wouldn't necessarily be a band council resolution. It could be some other form of approval. So, yeah.
Okay. My second question is the concern of whether adding the Liberals' amendment narrows what consent means. Because what I appreciate about CPC 1 is that it's not prescribing consent. And when I think about First Nations, when I think about UNDRIP, I understand consent to be a collective notion, not an individual notion. I remember we discussed this as well in a previous bill when we were talking about individuals and the difference between how collective First Nations as a governing body can show its consent. And I wonder if you can help better describe conceptually what is meant by this, as whether it's collective consent and how UNDRIP could be used to show that the minister did obtain consent from a First Nations governing body.
I can take thank you for the question. Maybe my colleague from Department of Justice can add. In my mind, I think there are two components now being considered. One is the minister must obtain, which means there must be an action that the minister must do in order to gain what we're defining, what we're calling consent. And I think we've talked at length about that. The new provision is like kind of how it'll be actualized, the modality or the instrument. I see them as different. One is about the must do something, and now that we're introducing a concept of how that will be done, I suppose, through, in this case, BCR. But so I see them as like cause and effect in terms of application, but I'm not sure if my colleague from Department of Justice has anything.
Yes. In terms of a collective right, a band council resolution could potentially capture that idea where you have members of the band who are represented by their council, and the council is a democratic representation. So they are acting on behalf of the collective if they provide a band council resolution. A band vote, I suppose, is the most direct indication of the consent of the membership, because everyone votes for or against. But you could take it one step removed and have a band council resolution, and that could signify consent of the membership, since that council is democratically elected.
So the Liberals' sub-amendment actually is the one that's creating more bureaucracy, because the minister would only see it as consent after they've seen the resolution, number one. Number two, for example, if there's a First Nations Water Authority, how would their consent be shown? Because when we look at the definitions in the definitions page about the First Nations governing body, the government or other entity that is authorized probably don't need a band council resolution. Am I wrong in that?
I think, thanks for the question. I think with respect to the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, they have obtained band council resolutions to act on behalf of First Nations. I haven't considered the practice here, but the BCRs in the Atlantic context is what brought to life the AFNW, the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, and that ongoing consent is part, or the ongoing collaboration with First Nations is part of the makeup. So I would imagine if they're talking about lawmaking powers or standards, that the AFNWA would need to partner, obviously, with First Nations to actualize those things. So I would say the template is there. To go back to I guess maybe the first part of the question about oversight, bureaucracy, and limitations, I think we've already spoken to that the concept of consent may create serious delays in the implementation of standards. It may create serious delays. And, to go back to the elevator brief of what this legislation was, it was twofold. One is the affirmation of self-government for First Nations to manage their own laws. The second is to close a regulatory and standards gap. The introduction of consent in this legislation could hinder seriously the second part of that objective, which is to close a regulatory and standards gap through the ambiguity of these terms.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. Next, I have Mr. Schmale and then Mr. McLeod.
Thank you very much, Chair, and appreciate the conversation we're having for a whole bunch of reasons, consistent to what we've been saying all along. And you know what? It even goes back to the conversations we had when we were discussing UNDRIP. And we had said at the time that we need to define and figure out what free, prior, informed consent was for a number of reasons. One of those was, how do you obtain a path to yes or no on a resource project? And we had brought up the point many times about what if a few people, a minority of people in a community vote no, but the majority vote yes towards something. And it was brushed off many times. And now we hear the point being made across the way that we need to figure this out because we can't have a few people turning down something that the majority wants. Then we go to the incident with the Wet'suwet'en and the energy project that was being developed there. Again, the elected band councils, 80% of the electors voted for the energy project. And of course, then Minister Bennett traveled all the way out to British Columbia to speak to those who were against the project, not the ones who were for it, that were ready to move forward with jobs, opportunity, and wealth in their territory. No. She talked to the ones who were against it. Now, why? Well, probably aligned with the ideology of the Liberal Party and shutting down energy projects all across the country. But at the same time, the position of this party on this side of the House remains consistent all the way through. We need a path for yes, we need a path for no. And we've said that I don't know how many times. But again, we're happy to work with the amendment. I know Mr. Melillo has already talked about that. But again, the same arguments that we are making that would have probably have led to a few more definitions being made in this piece of legislation where we wouldn't have these conversations again. Of course, we were voted down by the Liberals over and over again. And while we watch their position change over and over again based on what they want to achieve. But we have been consistent on this side about what would happen if we don't do the work, and exactly what we said was going to happen is happening. And that's very unfortunate because this could be moving a lot faster. So I won't delay it anymore, but I also want to point out that without defining these broad terms, and as Ms. Atwin was talking about, and her just before we wrapped up for the constituency break, one of the last things we were talking about was the green motion, and one of the things she had mentioned was the term about economic opportunities was too broad. We need to define that because it could mean anything. Well, you know what? We have a few terms here that we'd like to define because it could be too broad. It leaves us open to a few questions, and I think if by doing the work, we actually would make this legislation better and hopefully improve drinking water for those who are lacking the consistency and the action of the federal government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schmel. Next, I'm going to turn over to Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, free, prior, and informed consent is an inherent right of Indigenous people. And Jamie was correct when he said UNDRIP discussions, this came to the forefront. It almost sunk that piece of legislation coming forward. Consent from Indigenous people could come in many forms, many fashions. But I'm convinced that UNDRIP is broad enough that it covers most pieces of legislation, including this one. Doesn't mean we're going to have to redefine consent every time there's a new piece of legislation brought forward. I'm very concerned because from where I sit, I see this, the desire to want consent defined will probably sink this bill. I don't believe that our term is long enough for us to clarify that definition. It could take years. So I think by going forward with CPC 1, we're certainly going to look at jeopardizing this important and much needed piece of legislation. And I think there is a time that we're going to need further clarifications government-wide, but you can't do it on every piece of legislation. So I'm very concerned where this is headed when we entered an area where we don't have a clear definition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Batiste and then to Ms. Idlout after that.
Yes, and I agree with I echo the comments of Mr. McLeod and to some extent my friend Mr. Schmale. But sometimes, when my job is to read the room and then find a way to make the amendment salvageable because I live in a First Nations community and I know the potential implications of what could happen, and finding a way to make progress, not perfection. And so when Ms. Idlout says, does adding this clause and this amendment from CPC 1 create additional bureaucracy? Yes. But who controls that bureaucracy when you're looking at a band council resolution will be done by the community as opposed to others trying to say what that definition is. And so what this attempts to do is take everyone's read of what they would like to see and make it in a way that if a community has to demonstrate this, which they will have to demonstrate, that we give them the language and the wording that's consistent within the current Indian Act system that they've been working with for the last 150 years in terms of understanding what is the process for them to show consent if we're going to go down this road. And I heard from the other parties that they wanted to ensure that communities had a say in this. I agree with them. I don't agree that the term consent is the right one, but I think if we have, with this amendment, it makes it salvageable that everyone gets what they want, and at the end, the communities benefit without major delays. And that's the hope.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batiste. We'll go to Ms. Idlaut.
Thank you. I have a question for the experts regarding Clause 18, 1 and 2, and how sub 3 is envisioned. I wonder if you could describe for us the steps that will happen if no choice is made with just sub 1 and sub 2, and then explain how if we ended up approving CPC 1 without the sub amendment, how those steps would follow, so that we could have a better sense of what the potential reality will look like if C61 passes.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the question. So in essence, what would happen is there's different ways. So what?
This is only if no choice has been made, right?
Yep,
so there's already been
Okay.
a series of actions that had happened before.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Excellent. So if no choice is made, I would just also clarify that the choice could be made through a self-determined choice. So it could be a letter to the minister, could be a BCR that we've been discussing, could be a First Nation law as well. So if there's no choice that is made, it would require the minister and officials to reach out to the First Nation and have conversations depending on what their jurisdiction provincially is. We've heard from some First Nations, for example, in Ontario, where there's more of a preference around Ontario standards. Elsewhere, there's more preference around federal standards, and have that conversation and share very openly all the information we have at our disposal aligned with that consultation cooperation methodology, and then work together to determine what would be the best for that community. They might have specific technical instances that they have to take into account about their water treatment plant and how that factors into their choice. Together, make that choice and then confirm in writing what that choice is made and apply those standards accordingly.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sidlout. Not seeing any other hands up. Why don't we move to a vote? So, shall the sub-amendment to CPC 1 carry? Okay, I think
Sedwin.
Yes.
Mr. Battis.
Yes.
Mr. Henley.
Yes.
Mr. McLeod.
Yes.
Mr. Scapariggia.
Yes.
Mr. Melillo.
Yes.
Mr. Liepert.
Agree.
Mr. Schmel.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmer.
Yes.
Monsieur Simard.
Wait.
Ms. Idlaut.
I vote no.
Yeas 10, nays 1.
Okay, so CPC 1 has been sub-amended, carries. At this point, is there any debate on CPC 1 as sub-amended? Okay, I think looks like we can go to a vote. So, shall CPC 1 as sub-amended carry?
Ms. Atwin.
Yes.
Mr. Baptiste.
Yes.
Mr. Henley.
Yes.
Mr. McLeod.
Yes.
Mr. Scapariggia.
Yes.
Mr. Melillo.
Yes.
Mr. Liepert.
Yes.
Mr. Schmel.
Yes.
Mr. Zimmer.
Yes.
Monsieur Simard.
Wait.
Ms. Idlaut.
I wish I could say yes in whole, but I'll agree to it just because it is an important clause.
So, yes. Yeas 11, nays 0.
Okay, so CPC 1 as sub-amended will carry, and I think that's a good example of our committee members working together. Which takes us to Clause 18. Shall Clause 18 carry? As amended, carry. On division. Which will take us to new Clause 18.1. And the amendment we have first is BQ 7. Before going to that, I'll mention that if BQ 7 is moved, NDP 29 cannot be moved as they are identical. Also, BQ 7 and BQ 29 seek to introduce. BQ 7 and NDP 29 seek to introduce a new concept that is also related to NDP 49 and BQ 19. So with that, we are on BQ 7, and I will open the floor. Peut-être si Monsieur Simard.
If Mr. Simard wants to share something, I think that has been withdrawn. BQ 7 has been withdrawn.
Alors, on va
Okay, then.
to NDP 29, and I will give the floor over to Ms. Idlaut, should she
I
like.
didn't hear the French.
Oh, just the BQ 7 was withdrawn,
Oh, okay.
so that will we will move over to NDP 29, and I'll pass over the floor to Ms. Idlaut should you wish to move it.
Okay.
Thank you. This item, NDB 29, was given to us by the BC Assembly of First Nations, is to add 18.1, the governor and council may make regulations respecting the development of the dispute resolution mechanism provided by Section 25.1 in order to foster the entering into of agreements. Thank you.
Ms. Idlaut, we will go to debate, and first to Ms. Atwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see, so BQ 7 was not moved, and I had the same issue with the two of them, and so I'm just wondering if we have the ability to legislate over provincial jurisdiction, including the dispute resolution mechanisms, because that's what this is speaking to. I feel this would perhaps be infringing on constitutional rights, but I'd like to know what the experts could say.
I would agree that this would potentially infringe on provincial and territorial jurisdiction.
Ms. Atwin, not seeing any more hands up. Ms. Idlaut.
I just want to remind you that these will have an impact on because First Nations or Indigenous people did have were able to run their own governance, but when Canada became to be, they were taken, they were stripped of this, and then they want to see this they want to see regulations put in place for dispute resolution mechanisms. So I just want to remind you that this has been requested, so I urge you to pass this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Idlout. Mr. Melillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that intervention from Ms. Idlout. I do share the same concerns mentioned by Ms. Atwin about this, though, and I'll just, I guess, take it a step further. You mentioned, I believe it was Mr. Barbosa, and that this would overstep into provincial jurisdiction. Could you expand on the difficulty in enforcing this clause, given that reality?
Thanks for the question. I think one is the establishment of the dispute resolution commission comes with eventually finality. That finality can end up in court as an ultimate objective of how to resolve disputes, and the resolution in courts where it could impinge or infringe on provincial or territorial jurisdictions could have significant consequences and run potentially counter to the jurisdictional makeup of present-day Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. Not seeing any other hands up. Let's move to a vote. Shall NDP 29 carry?
Ms. Atwin,
No.
Mr. Baptiste,
No.
Mr. Henley,
No.
Mr. McLeod,
No.
Mr. Scaporeggio,
No.
Mr. Melillo,
No.
Mr. Lippert,
No.
Mr. Schmel,
No.
Mr. Zimmer,
No.
Monsieur Lemire,
Contre.
Ms. Idlout,
I say yes.
Yes 1, nays 10.
So NDP 29 is defeated, which takes us to clause 19 and NDP 30. So I'll open the floor back up to Ms. Idlout to move NDP 30.
Thank you, Chairperson. I move item number NDP 30. This was given to us by the Assembly of First Nations. I bring this forward, and it reads, recommendations and in collaboration with First Nations, make regulations respecting water. So it's to add for collaboration piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Idlout. Any debate on NDP 30? No, I don't think so. Okay. Not seeing any debate. Let's move to a vote on NDP 30. Shall NDP 30 carry?
Ms. Atwin,
I think we have.
Yes.
I think we have unanimous consent here. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Maybe let's go through a vote.
okay. Ms. Atwin,
In favor.
yes. Mr. Baptiste,
Yes.
Mr. Henley,
Yes.
Mr. McLeod,
Yes.
Mr. Scaporeggio,
Yes.
Mr. Melillo,
Yes.
Mr. Lippert,
Yes.
Mr. Schmel,
Yes.
Mr. Zimmer,
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire,
Contre.
Ms. Idlout,
I say yes.
yes 10, nays 1.
Okay. So NDP 30 is carried. which takes us to NDP 31. And again, I'll open the floor back up to Ms. Sidlout to move NDP 31.
Thank you, Chairperson. Regarding NDP 31, it was given to us by the Fire Hills Tribunal Council to amend the Clause 19 with the following: water and groundwater protection plans and the maintenance. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. I'll open it up for debate. I see Ms. Atwin has her hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to just challenge a notion that Mr. Morris brought to our committee, which is that if in fact a motion is moved and accepted, that it's within scope necessarily. I'm wondering just where the piece around groundwater specifically could extend beyond First Nation lands, where we are dealing with on reserve, outside of the source protection agreements, which would be forthcoming. So I'm just wondering about the implications of including the groundwater piece specifically, and whether or not it is within the scope of the bill.
Appreciate the question. I think it was for us. In terms of Section 19, it is specific to on First Nation lands. So with protection plans and water flowing, that would be broader than on First Nation lands.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Mr. Melillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just also want to clarify groundwater versus source water. I don't know if there's there must be some similarities to that, but I imagine the definitions would not be completely identical. If that could be explained a bit further.
Or not defined. Thanks for the question. Sources of water can be water where I'm trying to find it without the word. Sources of water where drinking water is obtained. That can be aquifers, groundwater, sometimes it's lakes. It varies considerably, and sometimes it actually refers to the source or the genesis of where water kind of comes from. Groundwater is anything under the ground. So it's inclusive of that term, but not solely source water.
Okay, and if I understood the previous answer correctly, that should this amendment pass, it would specifically apply to groundwater within a First Nation. Is that correct?
Under Section 19, yes, it is specific to on First Nation lands.
Okay. That's good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. Not seeing any other hands up. Let's move to a vote. Shall NDP 31 carry?
Ms. Atwin,
No.
Mr. Baptiste,
No.
Mr. Henley,
No.
Mr. McLeod,
No.
Mr. Scapolija,
No.
Mr. Melillo,
Yes.
Mr. Liepert,
Yes.
Mr. Schmel,
I follow Ron's lead, yes.
Mr. Zimmer,
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire,
Contre.
Ms. Idlaut,
I say yes.
yes, then, sorry. Yes, 5, nays 6.
So NDP 31 is defeated. Next, we will have BQ 8. If BQ 8 is moved, NDP 32 cannot be moved as they are identical. Mais avec ça, je vais donner la parole à Monsieur Lemire.
That being said, I will give the floor to Mr. Lemire for BQ8. So I think this is an important amendment for the bill. We feel that there are some significant loopholes in the bill. So the government did not consult sufficiently with Indigenous groups, but they need to ensure.
I'm not hearing the translation.
Quick break here to make sure that the translation is coming through.
Assurez-vous que
Je vais parler en
on passe.
français. Est-ce que vous...
I'll speak French. Can you hear me right now? Are you hearing me in English, Ms. Idlaut? Testing interpretation.
Je vais...
I'll try again. Can you hear me now? Just a moment. Someone's coming to help fix it.
OK, je vais essayer encore. Et maintenant,
Okay, I'll try again. Is it working now? Great. I apologize, Mr. Lemire. The floor is yours. Back to you. No problem, Mr. Chair. So I mentioned that this is a significant issue and one of the most important amendments, I think, that we have in this bill. How do we ensure that we're strengthening recruitment, training, certification, and the retention of water service operators, especially Indigenous communities? So we've said that this is an issue that the government needs to consult First Nations on and needs regulations to ensure that we can have resources for wastewater treatment and drinking water. So former SNC Lavalin has spoke to us about this. They've shared that this is an issue. They want to do business with Indigenous communities. They want to increase their independence, but they don't necessarily have the resources to offer these what they need to offer jobs. They're facing a lot of issues, and so we think that the federal government has a responsibility in this, and we think that we need to add this amendment on recruitment, training, certification, and retention of water service operators.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lemire. Et je vais ouvrir pour le débat.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. We'll open it up to debate now.
Thank you very much. And I think, I mean, it is getting to the heart of an important issue. I'm just concerned that, you know, while recruitment and retention are critical, important aspects, is this inadvertently asserting the Government of Canada into the decision-making for First Nations? I think it's a bit assuming on behalf of the government's role in this part, and the bill itself is ensuring that communities have the resources to then go do this and make decisions on their behalf. So maybe I can turn to our expert panel on this. And is this an area where we heard First Nations wanting that additional government oversight, or just provide some clarity, I guess?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. No, it has not been an area that's been specified by First Nations through ongoing engagement around this area. We do hear through that ongoing engagement definitely needs for, you know, adequate funding, sustainable funding, as you see throughout the rest of the bill, as well as with the funding framework that we'll get to as well as part of the study. So that's where it's more found, the First Nation input. But in terms of federal regulations, we have not specifically had from First Nations a desire for federal regulation in this matter.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Next, turn it over to Ms. Idlaut, et après ça, Monsieur Lemire.
BQ8 Amaru and
BQ8 and NDP 32 are the same, exactly the same. So, from our understanding, NDP 32 was given to us to this committee by the Assembly of First Nations. It was Assembly First Nations who were co-developing this C61. So I urge you to vote yes, because it will support and to educate about the freshwater services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Edlout. Next, on va aller à Monsieur Lemire.
Mr. Lemire? Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond in a friendly manner to my colleague that if it's not through training, recruitment, certification for the retention of water surfaces, then yes, by default, it becomes the responsibility of the government if we're not able to delegate this to the communities. So if this is the case, then we won't be moving forward properly.
Beaucoup, Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Mr. Batiste has his hand up, so I will pass the floor to you.
I think the concern from the government side on this is that we'd be not necessarily in the recruitment, but rather the retention of water operators. And water operators might want to go to where they're paid better by other communities. And for us to make a legislation that states that they have to retain people is taking away from First Nations' abilities to determine for their own communities what's the best path forward. I just am fearful that by putting in this language that we're telling them that they must or they shall retain their water operators. And I don't know if that would be consistent with their free prior informed consent, as we had mentioned before. But it's a small thing, but it's just something that we'd like the communities to be able to have that ability to determine which operators they choose to retain and how they choose to do that without government regulations specifying how they do it.
Batiste, next we have Ms. Atwin, and then Mr. Malolo.
Well, and just quickly too, I think that the bill gets to a lot of this as well. So there are existing measures in the bill described under Section 27, for example, that where those operations are included in that co-developed funding framework, which would then support these activities, but again, driven by First Nations and their self-determination.
Sorry. Thank you, Ms. Atwin. Next, I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Malolo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate this being brought forward. I'm leaning in favor of supporting it. I think these are very important things being added, especially with recruitment and retention. And I understand what Mr. Batiste is saying, where you don't want to be too prescriptive. You want to ensure that the First Nation has the opportunity to guide its destiny. I don't know any First Nations that would not want to retain water operators. I suppose if there was there was an individual who, let me ask this before I go further to the officials here. My understanding of the comments of Mr. Batiste, it seemed that his concern was, and he could correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed his concern was if there's a water operator who is perhaps not doing a good job, or the community does not want to retain that individual, that they would be forced to retain that individual. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is that the case? When I read this, I don't think this is specifying that any specific individual, but just broadly that would be the hope for the First Nation, if that question makes sense.
Thanks for the question. I think it did. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, certainly there's the question around so as it stands, as you know, First Nations are owners and operators of their water systems and employ individuals to perform those functions. So that exists. Certainly, so the section is on regulations. So we'd be creating a regulation on recruitment and retention I'm not sure in my mind what that would mean. Like training and certification, I understand. Not to get overly technical, but plants are designed to a certain level of certain standard. And the people who have to operate those plants have to be trained to that standard. So I can understand the alignment between a regulatory space between performing a function and ensuring the person that does that function is trained and certified. Recruitment intention from a regulatory standpoint eludes me on how that would, what regulation would we be making is kind of the question in my mind. So to me it is the alignment with the regulation, not about and the choice and the management of the systems is already in the hands of First Nations. Right. So I think we'd be creating considerable ambiguity, and I don't know what that means from what regulation would be performed. It eludes me greatly.
Okay. No, I appreciate that, and I think that's unfortunately been a common theme, a lot of uncertainty in definitions here. I guess my follow-up point would be any of what we are talking about here in this clause could be overridden, or the First Nation law could supersede it in the very next clause, the non-application. So, I think we're maybe having a discussion about something that may not even be applied anyway. We're talking about ensuring that there's First Nation choice and consent. As I read with the current legislation, with the non-application clause, the First Nation would have that consent to essentially opt out already. Is that not correct?
Yeah, as written, First Nations would opt out. I think, again, to what end? Like what regulation is being created, I think could create confusion, and a regulation over recruitment and retention, I haven't seen that. I don't think there's a precedent.
Very much, Mr. Melillo. À ce moment, je vais aller à Monsieur Lemire.
Mr. Lemire? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, I think we're trying to give more leeway if we're working with the governor and council. They can act more quickly on this field that affects training and recruitment. We know that these are one of the elements that are, some of the elements that are missing. So yes, we want to be able to give this power to the governor and council to be able to work directly with First Nations, and that means provide additional resources, but we need to provide them this power, and so it's important to include this in here.
Lemire. Next we'll go to Mr. Melillo and then Ms. Idlo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize for taking the floor again. I just noticed another aspect of this, that within this clause it states the minister may make regulations. It doesn't, my understanding is it doesn't instruct the minister to make the regulations. So again, I think we are maybe splitting hairs on something that is not necessarily enforceable or binding from that aspect. And maybe just to confirm, is it the case that should this amendment pass or not, that the minister would not be compelled to make such regulations?
Yes, the Government Council may make regulations on the minister's recommendation. So the Government Council does not have to make regulations on these matters, but the Government Council could do it if the minister so recommended.
Could those regulations be made now?
Could they be made?
Could they be made presently without this legislation even being in effect? Could such regulations be made as it currently stands?
No, you'd need this act.
Okay.
First Nations under the Indian Act do have certain bylaw making powers, but in terms of the minister, in the context of the section we're talking about now, you would need that act to make those regs.
Okay, so just make sure I understand. At the end of the day, the minister may or may not make these regulations, and if the minister does make these regulations, First Nation may opt out.
The only thing I'd mention is it's the Government Council makes the regs, on the minister's recommendation, but the Government Council does not need to make them. It's a may. And then, as you noted, if a First Nation makes its own laws, then they may opt out of the regulations in whole or in part.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you for the clarification. Thank you.
Next, we'll go to Ms. Edlout.
I'm so sorry, Mr. Barbosa, when you said, can I get you to repeat an answer that you gave about where you haven't seen it? Sorry, about.
No, it's okay. I appreciate it. It's good clarity. So I guess my quandary is around in a regulation space. I can understand training and certification regulation because it's aligned to a standard, a known standard. Where I am confused is a regulation that is to both recruit and retain operators. I haven't seen a parallel in law. I could stand corrected, but that is a regulation around recruitment and retention. I think hopefully that answers your question. I could be wrong.
I don't know. I might just be causing more confusion because I know that with the Nunavut agreement, with the Nunavut land claim agreement, we have Article 23, which is about Inuit employment. So I'm just wondering if this amendment is trying to serve a similar purpose where if a land claim agreement like the one that Nunavut has, where it talks about the importance of employment and training, that maybe what this amendment is trying to do is to ensure that regulation making powers for recruitment, training, certification, and retention of just the water services operators is something that is realizable.
Yeah, it's a good parallel. I think like Article 23, I think speaks about Inuit representation in territorial services. There isn't that level of specification here. It doesn't specify these individuals must be First Nation or must be retained their First Nation. So I would draw a distinction between Article 23 and the proposed amendment.
Next, I will pass the floor over to Mr. Batiste.
Kind of following up with Mr. Malillo said, that there's a lot of may, the Governing Council may, and there's a lot of things that may, all of these things may, but then in the non-application, a First Nations law would oversee it. So it's not a hill that we're going to die on over any of this, but just to note that the next 13 amendments are on things that may have no real ramifications other than us debating this over here. So if you guys want to skip over 19 as a general and just leave as is, nothing goes wrong. It would be efficient, but.
All right, not seeing any more hands up. Let's move to a vote. Shall BQ8 carry?
Mr. Twain?
No.
Mr. Baptiste?
No.
Mr. Henley?
No.
Mr. McLeod?
No.
Mr. Scaporeggia?
No.
I could go either way.
Mr. Mello?
No.
Mr. Lippert?
No.
Mr. Schmel?
No.
Mr. Zimmer?
No.
Monsieur Lemire?
Oui.
Ms. Idlaut?
Angikpunga.
I say yes.
Yeas 2, nays 9.
So BQ8 is defeated, and given that NDP 32 is identical to BQ8, it cannot be moved. Which takes us to NDP 33. And I will pass the floor over to Ms. Idlaut, should she choose to move it, but I may have something to say about it if it is.
Kuyan.
Thank you.
NDP 33.
I move NDP 33. It's being given to us by the Assembly of First Nations. Replacing, with the following. I'll read it in English.
The insurance required to be maintained by First Nations in respect of water services and water services operators, or by the minister on behalf of a First Nation that cannot reasonably obtain such insurance by ordinary means. And Koyanamik.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Idlout. So I'm going to have to make a ruling on the admissibility of this. The amendment attempts to create an obligation for financing that doesn't currently exist in the bill. And as the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, states on page 772, since an amendment may not infringe upon the financial initiative of the Crown, it is inadmissible if it imposes a charge on the public treasury, or if it extends the objects or purposes or relaxes the conditions and qualifications specified in the royal recommendation. So, with that, in the opinion of the chair, the amendment proposes a new scheme which imposes a charge on the public treasury. Therefore, I rule the amendment inadmissible. Okay. So, unless my decision is going to be challenged, we'll move on to NDP 30. Or sorry, we'll move on to NDP 34 in that case.
Koyanamik.
Thank you. This number NDP 34 was given to us by the Assembly of First Nations. In clause 19, be amended by the following. Under sections 14 and 15, respectively, and the treatment and disposal of wastewater as described under section 16. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. I'll open the floor for debate. I see Ms. Atwin has her hand up. Ms. Atwin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in line with similar conversations we've had, is this also potentially, again, infringing upon self-determination, so removing that oversight for how laws are applied over territories that First Nations govern? If I could ask the panel that.
Maybe a colleague did. I would say that it would, in conjunction with some other conversations we've had at this table, the proposed amendment could or would remove First Nations ability or First Nations choice. I'm not sure if my colleague has anything to add.
I would, sorry, I'm just taking a look at this. It does seem to relate back to 14, 15, and 16. So I don't necessarily see a legal issue, but there may be an issue for the department in terms of carrying out these obligations.
Maybe in case helpful, I'll just add the current draft of that regulatory making is really around standards broadly. So this proposed amendment would narrow that ability to those specific clauses in the standards section that were debated here today. So the question would be about kind of broad or narrowing.
Is there any other interventions? Seeing no more hands up, let's move to a vote. Shall NDP 34 carry?
Mr. Twain,
No.
Mr. Baptiste,
No.
Mr. Henley,
No.
Mr. McLeod,
No.
Mr. Scopaleggia,
No.
Mr. Mello,
Yes.
Mr. Liepert,
Yes.
We're just picking and choosing to.
Mr. Schmel,
Yes.
Mr. Zimmer,
Yes.
Monsieur Lemire,
Contre.
Ms. Idlau,
I say yes.
Yeas 5, nays 6.
So NDP 34 is defeated. Ça nous amène à big.
And that brings us to BQ 9. So I will give the floor to Mr. Lemire. Well, as you can see, BQ 9 has been withdrawn because we didn't send out the right version, so I'll bring you directly to BQ 10 in that case. Is that okay? Yes, on to BQ 10. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First Nations have been directly affected by industry decisions, and we've had many witnesses who have told us about the cumulative effects of this on their health. There are no regulations pertaining to this, so we'd like the government to clarify its expectations and protect First Nations. This responsibility is that to protect First Nations. And so we would like to create a regulatory framework that would govern the oil and gas and nuclear industries to protect water and source water on First Nation lands and in protection zones. So it's a form of social responsibility that we want to offer to First Nations because these companies often pollute but are not held accountable for the effects of this. And I was very touched by the witness testimony that we heard here from First Nations. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire.
Remind colleagues that we are on BQ 10 because we did move through BQ 9 quickly. So with that, I'll open it up for debate. Ms. Atwin, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm certainly in agreement with adding kind of additional layers to protect against, industry that is kind of threatening the health and safety of Indigenous communities. However, my concern is that most natural resource and industry frameworks do fall outside of First Nation lands specifically, and so what are the implications of adding this piece specifically in terms of how it responds to the other parts of the bill?
Appreciate the question. The key consideration is that water flows. And so this specific section in Clause 19 is about on First Nation lands. Therefore, there could be implications for provinces and territories of that flow off of First Nation lands and could be potentially impinging on provincial jurisdiction.
Thank you, Ms. Atwin. Mr. Zimmer.
Yeah, I guess, and it's been said previously by my colleague, Mr. Schmale, around even the Wet'suwet'en and sort of how resource projects, even resource projects that are supported by local First Nations and Indigenous communities, can kind of fall into this sort of problematic language where it could limit that development. And how many conversations have we had in this committee about economic reconciliation being a key to reconciliation for Indigenous communities? And so this, to me, especially in ridings like my own, where we have oil and gas, it's my riding that produces the natural gas to send to the West Coast, to the project LNG Canada, to distribute around the world, to really lower emissions around the world. And so that this kind of project would be limited potentially by this kind of language. And I guess I would be very much opposed to this because the risk it really puts all those future projects under. So that's why I would be opposed to it.
Mr. Zimmer. Next, we're moving to Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Chair, sorry? Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, just building off what Mr. Zimmer said, I think he said it quite well, but again, we were speaking about, and even Ms. Atwin mentioned it as well, that this is, or, pardon me, I believe it was in response to Ms. Atwin's question that that this falls specifically within First Nation land. And I think having the power for the governor and council to dictate terms of what economic reconciliation means, I think is very problematic. Obviously, there are First Nations that are opposed to resource development, some that are in favor of resource development and want to move forward with those types of operations. And I think that we have to ensure we are respecting all those voices, those that say no and also those that say yes. And I think that moving forward with this, again, notwithstanding the fact that it's a may and a might and a must and all of that, I think that it's a precedent I don't believe that the government should be going down at this point. We have to ensure that First Nations have the ability to chart their course on this, and that's an important part of economic reconciliation. I believe an important aspect of consent as well. So I would concur with my colleague, Mr. Zimmer, and encourage those around the table to vote against this.
Prochain, on va à Monsieur Lemire, and then
Next, Mr. Lemire, followed by Mr. Schmale. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand what the Conservatives have shared, and I've noted that, but there are several industries, including the agri-food industry and the mining industry, that have taken into account their impact on water, for example, in Quebec. So we can talk about sustainable development and reconciliation with nature. I think that we need to broaden the number of industries that are being affected by this. So we need to listen to what people are sharing with us for social acceptability and protecting First Nations. Thank you.
Et au prochain, next we'll go to Mr. Schmale.
Thank you very much, Chair. Okay, so I know the member from the bloc is a fierce advocate of nuclear safety and the proper disposal of waste. But again, unless I'm wrong, and maybe the officials can confirm, or even the bloc can confirm, we still have not defined protection zones, correct? Okay.
Here.
So again, we're coming up with, we're expanding industries that some don't like, clearly, but yet we don't actually define what it is we're actually trying to save here. Yeah, I think this is more of an ideological motion rather than actually trying to achieve the outcome of clean drinking water. So we're going to vote against.
Thank you, Mr. Not seeing any other hands up. Je vois une main. Monsieur Lemire.
Just
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I'd just like to remind us that there are epidemiological impacts of this that have been mentioned by witnesses. So this is not just a question of ideology. This has significant health effects when people do not have access to clear drinking water, and this is in many cases caused by these industries. Thank you.
Okay, seeing another hand up here, Mr. Malillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I apologize for taking the floor again. And it was mentioned right off the top in the first answer, but just having looked through this again, I want to make sure I'm clear about it. 19 pertains to First Nation land. Of course, in this proposal, it mentions First Nation lands and in protection zones, which, as we've heard from my colleague time and time again, we don't know exactly what that would be, whether that would be in First Nation land or potentially outside of it. So would this then expand the scope of 19 to be beyond the First Nation land, or potentially, or does it limit the scope of a protection zone to being reserve land?
Potentially, you are correct both ways. So
Okay.
because Section 19 is specific to on First Nation lands, any regulatory making power would be on First Nation lands.
Okay, interesting. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. With that, colleagues, let's go to a vote. Shall BQ 10 carry?
Ms. Atouin,
No.
Mr. Baptiste,
No.
Mr. Henley,
Brendan, no, I'm sorry.
No.
Mr. McLeod,
My fault.
No.
My bad.
Mr. Scapolja,
No.
Mr. Mello,
No.
Mr. Liepert,
No.
Mr. Schmel,
No.
Mr. Zimmer,
No.
Monsieur Lemire,
En faveur.
Ms. Idlaut,
I say yes.
yeas 2, nays 9.
So BQ 10 is defeated, which brings us to NDP 35. That, I'll pass the floor over to Ms. Idlaut.
Thank you, Chairperson. Clause NDP 35 and NDP 35 is to amend the following minimum standards in respect of water and source water, including the quality and the quantity of available water and source water as described under sections 14 and 15. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Idlaut. We'll move to debate, and Ms. Atwin, so you have your hand up.
The only concern again is just where clause 19 is built to be the may and the shall, because not the shall, but the may part, because it's ambiguous for a reason, because it's about those protection zone agreements that'll be signed with communities, again, through their self-determination. So it's the same kind of argument that I'm seeing, or that I'm making for a few of these, in that, of course, the spirit of the amendment I support. It's just that it's adding an additional layer that potentially then removes that self-determination piece. I think that a lot of these concerns that have rightly been brought forward by partners and yourself, it's just again, those details will come out in those protection agreements where they are then in the driver's seat of what that looks like for them. So any additional layers in this section specifically for me, I won't be supporting.
Very much, Ms. Atwin. Is there any, Ms. Idlaut?
I want to answer by answering the concern. If they are to imagine one government, then I would imagine they would be able to guess the outcome. But I think it will, we need to identify this, because I think we need to create regulations towards this. I think it would have. I think it would help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlaut. Not seeing any other. Okay, Mr. Smale.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. And to our officials, with this a potential amendment here, would that require any potential enforcement or anything like that? And how would it be kind of regulated in terms of the quality, the quantity of the water available and source water?
Appreciate the question. Enforcement is a common question with any federal legislation or any law. So it depends would be the answer. There is potential ability under enforcement to create kind of regulations around enforcement from a federal perspective, but there's also provisions in Section 6 that allow for First Nation laws to have enforcement mechanisms in First Nation laws as well. So it depends would stand.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Schmel. Seem unconvinced, but
No, I agree.
okay. Not seeing any other hands up here. Let's move to a vote. Shall NDP 35 carry?
Ms. Atwin,
No.
Mr. Baptiste,
No.
Mr. Henley,
No.
Mr. McLeod,
No.
Mr. Scaparija,
No.
Mr. Mello,
No.
Mr. Lippert,
No.
Mr. Schmel,
No.
Mr. Zimmer,
No.
Monsieur Lemire,
Contre.
Ms. Idlaut,
Ang Punga.
I say yes.
Yes 1, nays 10.
So NDP 35 is defeated, which takes us to NDP 36. I'll pass the floor back over to Ms. Idlaut.
Kaya na may accept.
Thank you, Chairperson. This NDP 36 was given to us by the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations to make regulations on, despite resolution mechanisms with respect to entering in an agreement under this act. Thank you.
Very much, Ms. Idlaut. We'll move to debate. I see Ms. Atwin has her hand up first, so I'll pass the floor to you.
There's a really important piece that we have previously enshrined as well, which is like determining that the federal government has this kind of convening power, but cannot legislate provinces and territories to do anything under their jurisdiction. And so just in spirit with what we've already enshrined in the bill and being really cautious about infringing upon those constitutional rights of provinces and territories, it's another example, I think, where it overrides where we can go with the bill. I'd just like to confirm, perhaps, because I'm not an expert, I'm going to refer to our panel, if I could.
I would concur. It's analogous to the previous conversation on dispute resolution and potential infringement on provincial territorial jurisdiction.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Any other interventions? Not seeing any. Let's move to a vote. So shall NDP 36 carry?
No.
Mr. Twin, no. You said no.
No.
Okay. Mr. Baptiste,
No.
Mr. Henley,
No.
Mr. McLeod,
No.
Mr. Scaparija,
No.
Mr. Mello,
No.
Mr. Lippert,
No.
Mr. Schmel,
No.
Mr. Zimmer,
No.
Monsieur Lemire,
Contre.
Ms. Idlaut,
Ang Punga.
I say yes.
Yes 1, nays 10.
NDP 36 is defeated. Et ça nous amène à BQ 11.
This brings us to BQ 11. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Speaking of reconciliation amongst First Nations, well, we need local autonomy. And we need to plan for local circumstances, and so we need minimum standards that are set out in the conditions in sections 14 to 16. And so referencing this will allow for better self-determination for First Nations and will allow them to adopt laws to better protect themselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire.
Information. If BQ 11 is adopted, NDP 37 cannot be moved because of a line conflict. So with that, we'll open up debate, and Ms. Atwin.
Just quickly, really in alignment here and supportive. However, I think that the language is slightly more preferable for NDP 37. So I would prefer to adopt that one than the very similar BQ 11. It's consistent with existing language that we have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Are there any others that would like to make an intervention? Mr. Melillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to keep reiterating the same thing about this, but I wonder about the tangible effect this would have. If there's any comments from our officials on that.
Appreciate the question. So with the proposed amendment, it would allow for different minimum standards. So that could have tangible effects as First Nations may want to work together in different regions of present-day Canada to ensure that they're making the best use of efficiency with technologies and different watershed management, etc. So with different minimum standards, that could present challenges for how to work really well together.
Okay. And the Liberal members just referred to NDP 37. What would be the difference in BQ 11 versus NDP 37?
They are quite similar in intent, but the difference being that there'd be, the addition of different potential standards, where the next one that was mentioned, I don't have the number off the top of my head, would allow for those existing minimum standards that were just debated by this committee to stay intact while allowing for those local circumstances, which is the overall intent of both of them.
Okay, so would it be your belief that NDP 37, the next amendment, would be more, what's the word I'm looking for, more in line with what was previously agreed to by the committee?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Melillo. Not seeing any other hands up. Let's move to a vote. Shall BQ 11 carry?
Ms. Atwin,
No.
Mr. Baptiste,
No.
Mr. Henley,
No.
Mr. McLeod, Mr. McLeod,
Oh.
Mr. Scaporja,
No.
Mr. Melillo,
No.
Mr. Liepert,
No.
Mr. Schmel,
No.
Mr. Zimmer,
No.
Mr. Lemire,
Oui.
Mrs. Dlart,
I say no.
yes 1, nays 10.
Alors, BQ 11 est rejeté.
BQ 11 is defeated.
Before we move on to that, Mr. Schmel.
Oh, yeah. I know we're going to wrap up like any second now. Before, it's just probably not going to get to start one. I was wondering if we could get an update on our motion that was passed to bring Ministers Haidju and Vandel back to committee. The 2-week deadline is approaching quickly, and I know there was some optimism that they would be here on Thursday, but unfortunately, I think Minister Haidju is appearing at the Operations Committee at the relatively same time, or close to the same time. So if we could get a quick update, that would be much appreciated.
Absolutely, Mr. Schmel. And I'll turn it over to the clerk to provide that update.
Yeah, the ministers have been invited, but they are not available on Thursday. And I sent an email to ask them to tell me when they can I attend. So yeah, I'm waiting for a response.
When did you send that email? Just out of curiosity.
On Thursday. To ask them to as
Okay.
a follow up.
So it's been a few days, so no response yet?
No, not yet.
Okay. How quickly do they usually respond?
Usually they take 1 week or, yeah. But I follow up again today. I'm still waiting for their
Okay,
answer.
because we'll have to deal with this as a committee if there's more delays. Yeah, okay. Well, we'll see what the Bloc and the NDP have to say as well, but we await your next update. Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, we're at 6:30, so is it the will of the committee to adjourn? Meeting adjourned.